Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, and welcome to episode, I'm losing count now, 106 perhaps, of the Monday Night Review. My husband has taken my children away for the weekend camping. I thought, God, I'm just going to get so much stuff done. I've in fact painted a lot. I've painted all the woodwork in my hallway. But that feels like it's about it. I've just had to do 4 coats, and my God, I hate painting. I hate painting. If I could, I would pay someone else to do it. I mean, it's just awful. Anyway, listen to some very interesting podcasts and some audiobook. I'd love to know your audiobook recommendations. I usually go for crime fiction. I really like the Montalbano series, which I finished. Currently listening to Midsummer Murders. Very underrated author, I think. Caroline Graham. Absolutely really good author. Very well written, those books. So yes, any audiobook recommendations? I'm actually listening to I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, which everyone raves about. I never read. I'm struggling to get into it. I don't know what that says about me. We have a really dark episode this week, so it might not be for everyone. You may have wondered, why are we not going on the tube recently? And we haven't been on the tube recently, and the reason we haven't is I've been putting this one off. Today we are going to Barking in East London. I mean, it's deep in East London. It's almost out the other side. And there's one reason, actually, that Barking has been in people's minds, because the case we're talking about today is quite recent. We're going to be talking about Stephen Port, aka the Grinder Killer. There's a real reason why I want to talk about this, and that's because of the way it was handled and how it was solved. So we're going to get into the details. There's a whole trigger warning for this, for murder, drug misuse, the whole bit. So it's quite... I've tried to keep it ungraphic. It's just not very nice. Sources for this are What Makes a Killer podcast, a TV series. There were 3 episodes called 4 Lives with very familiar British actor whose name is now eluding me. Oh God, tall guy from The Office. Stephen Merchant as Stephen Port, he's fantastic because he's just deeply sinister. But what makes 4 Lives very interesting is it was done in collaboration with the families of the victims. So the people playing the victims' families spoke to and was sort of not coached by, but it was all done. So Sheridan Smith plays one of the mothers, and she spoke a lot with the mother, and so it's really focused on the families and the victims, which is great. It's sinister, but it's not graphic. You don't see anything. Wikipedia, obviously, lots of newspapers, which aren't always the most accurate, but the thing that you'll see with this case is the media and the way the police handle it, and how the families deal with that. So at 4 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014, the emergency services received an anonymous phone call reporting someone needing medical attention on Cook Street in Barking, East London. The caller said, quote, "Looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something, just drunk. I was just driving in my car and just saw him lying on the floor, just got out, had a look at him." When paramedics arrived, they found a young man sitting cross-legged, propped up against the wall to a block of flats. The body was cold, and there was post-mortem pooling in the abdomen, showing that unfortunately the victim had been dead for some time. He was declared dead at the scene just before 8 a.m. on the 19th of June. And one of the paramedics who arrived on the scene was not satisfied that the man had died from a seizure, as the caller had said. So he covered the body with a blanket and waited for the police to arrive. Inspector Gary Learmonth arrived at the scene at 4:30 a.m. and stayed for 4.5 hours. He noted that the man had a bruised lip and a possible footprint on his torso. Though a bag was found next to the body, and in it was a vial of the drug GHB, Learmonth agreed that the death could potentially be suspicious. But when Dr. Mark Munro arrived at the scene, though he said that the body had probably been moved, he declared that the man had died in non-suspicious circumstances. He would later agree, when questioned by a jury, that he thought the cross-legged position of the man was, quote, extraordinary, but still decreed that the cause of death was probably a seizure. The body was identified as 23-year-old fashion student Anthony Walgate, originally from the Fordyke Avenue area off Leeds Road in Hull. Anthony's parents, Sarah Sack and Thomas Walgate, did not believe that their son had suffered from either a seizure, he had no history of them, or a drug overdose, and immediately spoke out about it. From the outset, the police handled the case poorly, writing Anthony off as a drug-taking gay escort who wasn't worth making much effort. For his family and friends, the minimal information and no follow-up on the obvious leads seems bizarre. From what we can tell, it actually was ages. You know, Sarah Sack is there in Hull with no news. Her baby is dead. He's been found dead in an area that she doesn't know. She is unaware of any drug taking, and obviously once your child moves out of home, they do lead this life that you don't know, but it just doesn't sit right with her. She was told that Anthony was found dead in the street with not a mark on him. They didn't seem to find this suspicious at all. She found it very suspicious. I believe that he had one needle mark in his arm. Now, I'm not a forensics person, but if you're saying that someone is a drug user and has died from a drug overdose, then are you saying that this is the first time he's ever used that drug with no other history of drug use? Because he's only got one needle mark in his arm, so it's not a regular thing. Police were able to track down the man who'd made the 999 call. It was 39-year-old Stephen Port, who lived in the block of flats where Anthony had been found. Police at the scene were given his name, address and phone number at 5:30 that morning while they were still at the scene, but his phone went straight to voicemail and repeated knocking on his door gave no response. Eventually, a statement was taken from him at 7:50 a.m. Anthony's friends, who had initially reported him missing, told detectives that he'd been planning to meet up with a man on the night he disappeared. Police eventually realised that it was the same man who had called 999. Stephen Port was arrested, his laptop seized, and his DNA taken. During an interview, he changes his story and says that Anthony had taken drugs and fallen asleep after they'd had sex. Port had gone to work, leaving Anthony asleep in his flat, and when he got back from his shift, the 23-year-old was still asleep. The following morning, he found Anthony dead, panicked, and then carried the body outside. The police believed this story, though surely someone being asleep for that long is suspicious. The whole thing sounds suspicious from the get-go. On the 26th of June, Stephen Port is charged with perverting the court of justice and a trial date set for March 2015. Port was sent home on bail. His laptop went home with him, unchecked. Little did they know that they had just let a serial killer back into the community. An inquest into the death of Anthony was held, and though the parents maintained that there was something suspicious about their son's death, and the court heard from police and paramedics that something strange was going on, this was all contradicted by the medical examiner, who said there was nothing suspicious. 22-year-old Gabriel Kovari had moved to London in 2014 after completing his degree in his home nation of Slovakia, and was hoping to use his skills as a linguist to train as a translator for the NHS. Gabriel met John Pape via an LGBTQ plus dating app, and John realised when they met up that this boy was young and actually needed support, and so offered him a spare room in his flat in Deptford for £50 a week while the young man found his feet in London. They spent 6 weeks bonding, watching TV together and occasionally visiting a gay bar for a drink. Then Gabriel said he was moving out to live in Barking with the man he'd met online. Pape was surprised, but kind of assumed that living in a small flat with an older gay man was hindering Gabriel's love life and life in general probably, And so he didn't ask any questions. And on the 23rd of August, Gabriel moved to Barking to sleep on the sofa of a man named John. The man was actually Stephen Port. Ryan Edwards is a neighbour of Stephen Port's, and he would often meet men that Stephen brought home. And he met Gabriel, who describes him as being a talented artist, kind, outgoing, and articulate. During their meeting, when Port went to the loo, Gabriel whispered to Ryan, quote, "Stephen is not the man you think he is. He's a bad man." Ryan said Gabriel was different from the other men that Stephen brought home, and they swapped numbers and stayed in contact and messaged each other. But then suddenly the messages stopped. Ryan asked Port what was going on with Gabriel, and Port said he wasn't sure. Then he changed to Gabriel had gone off with a man from the army. And then a week later, Port sends Ryan a really weird text message saying that Gabriel had gone back to Slovakia and died from a mystery illness. Meanwhile, John Pape had sent Gabriel a message about things to do with his flat, but he didn't hear back. He messaged again and asked how everything was going and said if it doesn't work out in Barking, you're welcome to come back to the flat. Still no response. On the 28th of August 2014, just 5 days after Gabriel had moved out, police arrived at John's doorstep. John had actually given his address to help Gabriel set up a bank account, and so for the police, this was their way of getting in contact because remember, Gabriel's from Slovakia. Gabriel's body had been found by a dog walker in the graveyard at St Margaret's Church in Barking. He was propped up against a wall, and it appeared too that he'd died from a drug overdose. Over the coming days, Pape realised that there were no tributes from family and friends on the dead man's Facebook page. He contacted the coroner, and it would turn out that nobody had told the family or Gabriel's, says some have it as boyfriend, others have it as ex-boyfriend in Spain. Pape was actually asked if he could inform them. It would turn out that the family liaison officer assigned to Gabriel's case even failed to contact the victim's loved ones at all and referred to him as being from Lithuania rather than Slovakia. The shonky way police seemed to be dealing with it led John Pape to go on Google, and it wasn't long before he realised that another young man had been found dead, and that man was Anthony Woolgate. He messaged the police and the coroner numerous times, mentioning the link between the two deaths. 2 young men, no history of drug abuse, dying in the same area within months of each other, both propped up against walls. All contact was ignored. Police also didn't follow up a trace to Gabriel's friend Carl, who he'd been sending pictures to. Gabriel had been sending him pictures from inside Port's flat when he arrived, and he was the last person that Gabriel had spoken to. John Pape turned detective to find the victim's boyfriend in Spain, Thierry Amodio, who also became frustrated with the police's handling of the case. He went on Facebook and made contact with John Luck, who was the name that Stephen Port was using. Luck said he'd seen Gabriel at an orgy in Barking. Amodio told John Luck he had to take this information to the police, which obviously John Luck, Stephen Port did not. Amodio then sent John Luck's Facebook info to the police. They never followed it up. Had they followed it up, they would have discovered that it was Stephen Port, and surely even they would have got an alarm bell ringing that Stephen Port had admitted that Anthony Woolgate had died in his flat, but now he's talking to another boy who's disappeared and then been found dead. John Pape eventually went to Peter Tatchell, who is a LGBTQ plus campaigner and who encouraged him to go to Gallup and Pink News so that they would go to the police to ask for information on the deaths of these men in the area. And they were told that they were completely unrelated and there was nothing unusual about these deaths. And an inquest into the death of Gabriel Cavari returned an open verdict. Then on September the 18th, 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth started talking to a man via an online dating site, and the two decide to meet. 2 days later, his body was found by the same dog walker in the same graveyard. His boyfriend had initially been told that Daniel had been found hanged. He was told it was an overdose. Near Daniel's hand was a note saying that he'd accidentally killed Gabriel Cavari with drugs during an orgy, and he'd taken his own life through guilt. The note is really bizarre. I'm going to read it here in full. I'm sorry to everyone, mainly my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice while we was having sex that he had stopped breathing. I tried everything to get him to breathe again, but it was too late. It was an accident. I blame myself for what happened, and I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I go to the police, and I can't do that to my family, and at least this way I can at least be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. BTW, by the way. Please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then I left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so if it does kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now. Took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing. I dropped my phone on the way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere. Sorry to everyone. Love always, Daniel PW. Daniel's stepmother is told that he's taken his own life. And when she and Daniel's father saw the note, they found it odd. It's also in a plastic folder. You know those plastic folders? I believe it was in a plastic folder with holes punched down the side. She said it doesn't sound like Daniel, and she says there's no mention of specific family members. It doesn't sound like him. The context is all wrong. I didn't tell my family where I was going. You wouldn't say that if this letter was a note to your family. And then the mention of the man he spent last night with immediately brings attention to who was that man. If there had been no mention of, by the way, don't blame the man I was with last night, you wouldn't even think about it. You wouldn't know there was a man. Also, he's feeling dizzy, he's taken all of these drugs. Does he then pop it into a nice plastic covering? Police, however, don't think it's strange that the boy had taken a drug overdose to kill himself, then carefully put the note in a plastic folder. That this note, which the police must have seen a lot of suicide notes, doesn't really read like one. It's not addressed to anyone in particular. It doesn't fit with how the family feel the boy would write. Daniel's body is sitting against the graveyard wall on top of a blue bed sheet, and the clothing on the top half of his body exposed his stomach, so like he'd been dragged by his feet and his clothes had rocked up, and they don't seem to wonder where he's got this blue bed sheet from. He lives with his family. Where's this blue bed sheet from? They don't care. It's not from his family home. He doesn't live anywhere else. They're not interested in that. Bruising under his armpit showed that he'd been moved, but the police weren't fussed about that either. It would turn out that Stephen Port's DNA was on the blue bedsheet, on Daniel Whitworth's body, and on his clothes. It's also on the plastic sleeve that the note was found in, and the police already had Stephen Port's DNA because they'd taken it when he'd been arrested. But they don't test anything for DNA because they don't deem that this is worth checking. They just think it's another gay man dead from a GHB overdose, this time at his own hand because he'd previously killed another guy. So for the police, they've got Stephen Port, who says that, Daniel took Anthony took an overdose in his flat and he felt awful, so he moved it. And then you've got Daniel admitting to killing Gabriel by accident, and then Daniel kills himself. It's all very neat and tidy, but it's not. They're all found sitting up in the same position. So I'm sure a lot of drug overdoses are found in similar positions because that is how the body goes for comfort. But they're just not linking them at all, and none of them are found deemed suspicious. and they don't consider a link to the three bodies. On the 23rd of March 2015, Stephen Port pleads guilty to perverting the course of justice during the investigation into the death of Anthony Walgate. He's given 8 months in prison. He serves 2 of them and is released on the 4th of June 2015. When he gets out, Ryan Edwards texts him to say, what's been going on. And Port replies saying, "It was a 90-second mistake that cost me several months of my life in prison." Now, on the 12th of September, so he gets out on the 4th of June. On the 12th of September 2015, 25-year-old Jack Taylor from Dagenham in Essex has been at the Trades Hall Club, and he has been chatting to a man he met on Grindr. And in the early morning hours, Jack gets into a taxi to Barking to meet the man and go back to his flat. He always let his family, who he lived with, know if he wasn't coming home. He's very close to his 2 sisters. And so 2 days later, on the 14th of September, they're frantic, he hasn't come home. And then the police arrive at their door. And the body of Jack Taylor has been discovered in St Margaret's Church graveyard on the other side of the wall from where the 2 previous bodies have been found. Police find drug paraphernalia near his body, including a bottle of GHB, and it was said that he died of an overdose of the drug. To his family, this didn't make sense at all. Jack was anti-drugs. He was afraid of the dark. For him to be found this way went against everything they knew about him. And this wasn't just parents who don't know what their young son is up to. This is his sisters as well. They were like, there's no way that he would have gone into a graveyard in the dark by himself. Just absolutely no way. And so for them, they were immediately aware that something wasn't right. So they push and they ask to see the CCTV footage of his last moments. And the police say, well, it's clear cut. He meets this tall guy, they chat for a bit, and then he's seen walking by himself into the graveyard. And the girls are like, no, let's see it. And so they show him meeting a tall, fair-haired man in Barking Station. And then it turns out that the sisters are watching and they say, that guy that you think is him walking on his own to the graveyard is not him. It's a similar dark-haired guy, but it's not him. And police are suddenly like, oh, yeah, it's not him. Eventually, in October 2015, thanks to the pressure from the family, police released the images to the public of stills from this CCTV where Jack is meeting someone, and the mysterious man is identified as Stephen Port. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about Stephen Port. He's born on the 22nd of February 1975 in Southend. His family moved to Dagenham when he's 1. He's an introvert and has trouble connecting with other people. He's quiet and awkward. In fact, some people think he's deaf because he just doesn't have any seeming involvement in the world around him. And so they think it must be that he can't hear, and therefore that's why he's not engaging. He's detached and disengaged from other people. He graduates from college and he briefly attends art school. He is a good artist, but he has to drop out because his parents can't afford it. So he goes on to train as a chef, but he feels really bitter about having to drop out of art school. And he blames other people for everything, basically. In 2005, at the age of 30, he moves out of home and into this flat in Barking. One of his neighbours, Ryan Edwards, who we've heard from, befriends Port as a fellow gay man. There's not many gay men in the area, and so they strike up a friendship. He said, Ryan Edwards says that Port was very quiet and he never really gave eye contact. And though he thought there was something strange about Stephen, but obviously couldn't imagine what he was capable of. He tells a story of when he was getting his flat ready for a party and he's clearing out everything, and Ryan finds a toy truck and he says, I think I'm going to give this to Stephen. And the friend who he's with is like, why on earth would you give a child's toy truck to a grown man? That's really weird. And Ryan was like, I just think he's going to like it. And sure enough, Port loves it and sits down on the floor during the party and begins playing with the truck like a child would. Stephen Port would target his victims through online dating apps. His awkward personality made it difficult for him to meet men in person. Online, he could create a fantasy world, and he often told people he was either an Oxford graduate, a special needs teacher. Others were told that he'd been in the army. And Ryan describes Port's dating as prolific, with new men every couple of days. Port would always describe them as his boyfriend and would say, "Do you want to meet my new boyfriend?" But it was notable that he was mostly interested in men who were a fair bit younger than him. This is partly to do with him feeling more comfortable with younger people, probably, but also a whole thing about control. He wanted power, so he would target younger, vulnerable men. Some told Ryan that he was mentally abusing them, but they stuck around, so there's obviously some form of control that's working. Port was also obsessed with drug-fueled sex parties. And Ryan went into his flat one day and saw a box on the coffee table that was just full of drugs, vials of clear liquid, bags of powder. And after seeing that, Ryan began to distance himself. It just wasn't his jam, the whole drug sex thing. And had police checked Stephen Port's laptop when they first arrested him and took his laptop in, they would have found his internet search history very disturbing. It could have prevented further deaths. He was constantly looking up things like rape, unconscious boys, that kind of thing. Port contacted 23-year-old Anthony Walgate on the 17th of June 2014. So Walgate is a fashion student. He sounds lovely. But he supplemented his income working as an escort, and that evening Port offered him £800 to stay the night. They met at Barking Station and went back to Port's flat, where he drugged Walgate with GHB and raped him. So GHB is the date, also known as the date rape drug, because it's smellless, tasteless, and you just slip it into someone's drink and they don't know they've taken it. Port gives him a fatal overdose, whether deliberately or by accident, we don't know, and then dragged his body outside to where it was found. It must have been terrifying for him when he gets taken in for perverting the course of justice, but for him also, he must have seen the incompetence of the police in dealing with this. They have the murderer in custody. They have his laptop. They don't bother to check it. They're not listening to the family that say Anthony would not have taken GHB. They're not listening to Anthony's friends who are saying that it wasn't what he was like. And they're just looking for the easiest route out. It must have felt easy to Port to carry on. He's been in the police being interviewed for a murder he committed with a pretty basic lie and got away with it. On the 25th of November 2016, Stephen Port was found guilty of 22 charges, including 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of administering a substance with intent, and various sexual offences. Handwriting experts confirmed that Daniel had not written the supposed suicide note, and the writing in fact belonged to Port. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he'd spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he is sent to Belmarsh Prison. Stephen Port was ultimately caught due to the persistent efforts of the families of his victims and the increased scrutiny brought upon the police investigation. Initially, the police had treated the deaths as unrelated drug overdoses. They're very dismissive of the of gay men and of the LGBTQ plus scene. You know, all gay men must take GHB, all gay men must be escorts, it must therefore, it's the same that we see over and over again with cases like the Yorkshire Ripper, or Jack the Ripper. Any woman who is targeted and does sex work, she asked for it, it's her own fault. And it's the same with gay men. they must all take GHB. They must all be, asking for it. And this really challenges that. The fact that there are so many people going to the police and saying, this is not what Daniel was like. This is not what Jack was like. Pressure mounted, and an independent review of the initial police response to the deaths was conducted. The review criticised the handling of the case and highlighted the police's failure to link the deaths, which led to a lack of urgency in the investigation. And I would argue that 3 of those deaths could absolutely have been prevented and are on the police hands. They had the murderer. They had the murderer's laptop, which had sinister things. That they would also find video footage later on of Stephen Port raping unconscious men. They missed this all. Following the review, a fresh investigation was launched and the police started to re-examine the evidence. Detectives began to establish connections between the victims and identified Stephen Port as a person of interest. Port was known to have been in contact with all 4 victims through dating apps and websites. In fact, if the police had bothered tracing the IP address from the John Luck Facebook link sent to them by Gabriel Cavari's friend Thierry Amodio, they would have seen that it matched Stephen Port's. They've had all of this. It's completely bonkers. And I always talk about, true crime. One of the things that we love about it is that it's like being given an old puzzle with all the pieces but no picture to follow, and you don't know what the picture is. And you've got to try and get all the pieces together. This is like a puzzle for a 6-year-old, with 20 pieces, and the police have failed to put any of them in the right place. In 2021, Home Office pathologist Dr. Olaf Beretsky confirmed that Anthony Walgate died after being poisoned with excessive quantities of the drug GHB. The doctor said bruising found on Walgate's body was consistent with him being moved while still alive, even if unconscious or near death. So that even rules out that perhaps the story of Anthony taking an overdose himself in Stephen Port's flat and Stephen Port finding him dead and moving outside, that didn't happen. When he was moved outside, he was still alive, even if he was near death. And the reason I wanted to cover this case is it raised significant concerns about the police response to the deaths and the initial assumption that the victims had died from self-administered drug overdoses. It also highlights the vulnerabilities towards the LGBTQ+ community and the importance of taking all reports of missing persons or suspicious deaths seriously, regardless of the victim's background. And that is the story of Stephen Port, the grinder killer. I could have done this as a 2-part episode, but for me it is such a clear-cut case of police incompetence, an evil man. There's nothing complex about him. There is nothing interesting about Stephen Port. He is just a horrible, evil man who managed to kill 4 young men under the nose of the police. It's just a horrible tale. I hope you are all well. Do contact me via email, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. I love to hear your recommendations. I really do. It honestly makes me so happy. If you want to buy a t-shirt, you can check out the merch in the link below. You can find us on social media at The Monday Night Review. Until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seats before you drive.